Diane and Robert. Welcome, everyone. My name is Lonnie Pfeiffer. I'm with Disability Rights California. My colleague Raymond Kwong, who's in the San Diego area, and yours truly, staff attorney Emily Ikuta, who is your presenter for this afternoon. For those who don't know us, we were formerly known as Protection and Advocacy. We are a nonprofit organization that was founded in 1978. We are federally mandated to provide legal services for people with disabilities. Some of the issues we work on can be anything from special education, public benefits, regional center services, housing, employment, and so forth. Our offices are in Sacramento, Los Angeles, Bay Area, and San Diego. Our smaller offices are Fresno, Ontario, and Modesto. I'm now going to go ahead and turn it over to Raymond, who will formally introduce your presenter today.
Good afternoon. So presenter today is Emily Ikuta. She is a staff attorney here with Disability Rights California's Legal Advocacy Unit. She works within the Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities Practice Group, which strives to help individuals with developmental disabilities access regional center services and avoid institutionalization. So without further ado, I will pass the floor to her.
Good afternoon, everyone. So it's a pleasure having you. It's a pleasure having you here at this presentation today. I will do my best just to go over the basics, give you some tips, some advice, some information about how you and also how other people you share this information with can really be prepared and the best approaches to going to an IPP meeting and getting the services that you or your family member needs. And so as Leilani and Raymond mentioned, I am an attorney at DRC. My specialty actually is largely involving access to regional center services, and I've provided a wide array of services for clients of many different kinds of regional centers, among the 21 spread out the state. So from Inland Regional Center, Golden Gate Regional Center, one of the LA regional centers. It runs the whole gamut, and I provided and those services are representing at IPP meetings, drafting complaints, actually going to fair hearing. It is the services that we provide free of charge, but it also counts on my availability and what our resources allow. So now that I've given that brief overview and spiel about DRC, let's get into the presentation. So before I really kind of get into those tips and the advice and, how to really prepare for these and getting the services that you feel you need from the regional center, I feel it is important to really go over just why the regional center exists. What is the point of this whole system? What is the purpose? And by going over this, it will help you to be better prepared in making your case for the certain types of services that you or your family member / child needs. So the purpose of these services and supports, well, it is to basically help those who have developmental disabilities to live as independently and productively as possible, to basically to try to aim toward living approximate to as it quoted here, the pattern of everyday living available to those who do not have disabilities and are the same age. And so and when I say consumer, and if you see the word consumer sprinkled all throughout this presentation, that's literally the word to refer to a person who gets regional centers services from the regional center. It's like, so if you're wondering, like, why do you keep using the word consumer? It's like, yep, that's the word, that's the term. If your child qualifies for regional center services, they are a consumer. So just want to address that. But you or your child, or on behalf of a family member, can ask for any services and supports that lessen or address the effects of your developmental disability, to help you to live a more independent, productive, and normal life, and to learn new skills. So to give you just an overview of how the whole regional center system and the services were created. It was all due to the Lanterman Act. So this was a set of California laws passed in 1977. I put down the range of the specific codes. It's actually in the Welfare and Institutions Code, or I call it WIC for short. So you'll see that sprinkled throughout the presentation. I do try to put citations to the actual law. So you are also have that knowledge on hand with you of like, oh yeah, that's the law that says this or that. And on top of that, there's also law codes, statutes relating to regional center services also located in the California Code of Regulations, CCR Title 17. So just letting you, and I put the links where you can actually find the statutory language that describes the regional center system and the services that go along with it and the rights. That being said, it can be a pain having to read through this dry legal, statutory language. So we actually do have a manual specifically created for, in layman's terms, called Rights Under the Lanterman Act Manual, or RULA Manual. And it's all available on our website. We have it in other languages, or I know we have it in Spanish. So just letting you know that you can find information about the Lanterman Act here. You can also get a more straightforward, simplified version available on DRC's website. I also just put down the links to relevant agencies. So a big one, DDS, or Department of Developmental Services. That is the state agency that oversees the regional centers. So those 21 regional centers, they're monitored by DDS. DDS is also the one that basically funnels the money to the regional centers. And to add to that, there will be situations where DDS will actually issue orders, basically like instructions, directives to the executive directors of each regional center. It was especially something that was it became especially prolific during the pandemic. That's when everything was basically appended and going through a lot of change. And so there was a lot of directives being released, just instructing regional centers, okay, this is what your guys are going to do given the circumstances of this pandemic. So and I put a link of where you can find those directives and where they're posted. And like I said, there are 21 regional centers spread out throughout the state of California. Each regional center will have their own website, but just in case, I also put down the link. We also put down the link to the actual list of the regional centers posted on DDS's website, as well as, which also has the links to each regional center's website. Another great resource that exists to help consumers of the regional center is the State Council on Developmental Disabilities, or SCDD for short. And they actually have different regional offices throughout the state. And I put down the link where you can find those regional offices and more information about SCDD. So now that I've gone over just like the overview, the foundation of the whole regional center system, let's get into, okay, what services and supports and how can I get that through as I'm navigating the regional center system? So so I really want to emphasize and have you take away from this presentation that services and supports, they're going to be determined through the IPP process. IPP being individual program plan. The IPP process is the means by which the team, the other persons invited, service providers, service coordinator, the team, looks at the needs and preferences of the consumer, and if appropriate, also the family, especially if it's like a very young consumer where, yeah, obviously they're going to be looking at the circumstances of the family, the background, and what is best for that particular child. And the services and supports, the whole team needs to consider, let me rephrase. So there are it's through these IPP meetings that different service options and proposals are raised. among and by the IPP team, which also looks into how effective are these options in meeting IPP goals and how cost effective each option is. I also want to touch on that you guys may have heard, or if not, again, this is just a breakdown of that. The least costly alternative, this actually relates to the most cost-effective option, where regional centers, they are required to go with if a service is needed, they would have to authorize the service that is, as the word is used in various codes, the most cost effective. Now, if you're thinking, wait, it just automatically goes to the cheapest one? No, that's not necessarily what that means. What it does mean is that you find what is the option that is cost effective, but also still meets you or your family members' needs. So that's where, so that's why I mentioned that, and also the least costly alternative. The regional center must purchase services from the least costly provider that can meet your needs. That part is important. And I actually we actually included this language from one of the codes in the Lanterman Act. The consumer, you or your family member, shall not be required to use the least costly provider if it will result in you or your child moving from an existing provider of services or supports to a more restrictive or a less integrated system of services or supports. So in other words, what this means is that, yes, cost effectiveness is a factor, but it also looks into what are the options that allow you to live in the most least restrictive, the most integrated type setting. So what setting allows you to go out in the community? What setting allows you to have more freedom, but still meet your goals? So these are important factors that all should be taken into consideration, not just what's the cheapest one on the table. So another important element that I want to bring to your guys' attention as we're, before I go into more detail about tips for getting quality regional center services, is what is called purchase of service policies. We call them POS for short, POS policies for short, because everything has to be acronyms. And so if you're wondering, okay, what are these purchase of service policies, or at least how does it apply in this, in my calculation about getting these services? They are policies, as the name indicates. Sometimes they go by or they're referred to as simply as service policies or as guidelines, and they are guidelines for how and in what circumstances the regional center will authorize and arrange certain services and supports. These policies will explain the requirements for getting those services. Some policies will actually put like limits, like, oh, this amount of frequency or this number of services per certain time period. And these policies, they do vary by regional center. And by vary, I mean like the actual specific wording and breakdown of the criteria may be different from one regional center's policies to another. That being said, those policies cannot stray outside of the rights that you are entitled to under the law, under the Lanterman Act. And also, I just want to emphasize that policies are important, but they're not necessarily, they're not in and of themselves binding because they're policies. So, we have seen policies before where I was like, wait a minute, why is there this restriction? Is there a law that is bound? Is there a law that is tied to this? No. Okay, then don't have that in there. So just letting you know, giving you that heads up that policies are, they're relevant and important, but they don't necessarily in and of themselves completely cut off just because they access to a service just because they say so, if it's not in any way, especially if that service actually is permitted under the law. So just giving you that heads up. And even then, even with these policies, regional centers are responsible for ensuring that all needed services are being provided. Basically, like if you need these services, and then the regional centers must ensure that you're actually able or making efforts that you actually have access to those services. Just continuing on the policies part, Regional centers actually have to post their policies on their website. They have to make them publicly available, and not just their policies. If they have like assessment tools, so like, Harbor Regional Center, for example, they've got assessment for determining how many hours of respite you get. Those are also have to be available. Either on their website and also when you can ask for those policies. And that's something we actually encourage families to do, where it's like, oh, that's is that the policy? Okay, give me that policy in writing. They have to have it. And these policies, these assessments, these tools, they will include information and guidelines about determining the need and the amount of something like transportation, personal assistance, independent or supported living service needs. This is a non-exhaustive list. There can be that some policies go way into detail and put a big, long, huge array of different services that they have policies for. Other regional centers don't really are a lot more sparse. Some of them don't even have a real written policy on like PA, for example. That doesn't necessarily mean you can't ask for it, but that's what I mean by like these policies can vary from one regional center to another. And just to give you an idea, we actually put down a link to a sample of purchase of service policies. This one is actually North Los Angeles County Regional Center. Now, that being said, policies also need to be updated if there's, let's say, changes in the law. And I'll touch on it really quick, but there have been some actually important changes to the Lanterman Act. So it turns out these laws actually can change and be reformed or have reforms to them. And the most recent being there was actually changes into the whole appeals process. When you're like, your right to actually appeal and disagree with a regional center's decision. There's also been changes that allowed access to services that were previously restricted, like social recreation. So just giving you a heads up that on top of having these policies, they should also be updating these policies as necessary so that they don't end up contradicting laws that have recently been reformed or changed. Another important, an important aspect to your strategy for pursuing the services that you or your family needs, and it's one you really should take into consideration: generic resources, also referred to as generic agencies. And so, if you're wondering, okay, if it's important, but what is this? A generic agency is defined in the law as any agency receiving public funds with a legal responsibility to serve all members of the general public. So, okay, what does that mean? What it means is that if you can get the same or a similar enough service, not just from the regional center, but if you could get that from another agency available to the public, you actually have to exhaust that other agency, the generic agency, before you can turn back to the regional center and request that service if it turns out you actually couldn't get it. And so if you're wondering what is meant by that, regional centers describing themselves as the payer of last resort, that's what that means. That refers back to to having to exhaust generic resources. So just to reiterate, regional centers are prohibited from purchasing any service that would otherwise be available from generic agencies or generic resources. And I actually put down a list of the most common ones. A big one is going to be insurance, Medi-Cal, Medicare. Another one is in-home supportive services from the county, IHSS. And now, that being said, we have gotten clients who've had service coordinators that were like, oh, you want more respite hours? You ask for more IHSS. We have a problem with that because IHSS and respite are not necessarily the same service, but it is something that comes up as like a potential obstacle. Another common generic resource, often for like those who qualify for them, adults, would be the Department of Rehabilitation. That's where it's more like, oh, I need services to help learn job skills or secondary education. You actually can get services like that from the regional center. But it's also something where you are going to have to take into account the Department of Rehab. And in fact, I've had clients where they've had a system set up where they had both agencies collaborating and coordinating with each other, as they should. That's what they're supposed to do. So like the example, think like, oh, DOR, for example, helps to arrange, this person's potential internship, while the regional center provides the job coach. So just giving you an idea of how they should be coordinating. Another big one, especially for young school-aged clients, is the school district. So that is a generic resource, a generic agency. So it's not on, often that will be a regional center's response of like, well, can you get that service for your child from the school district? Got to go through them. So just giving you a heads up, that's one of the, that's a common one. And as I mentioned before, private insurance or some other healthcare service plan. Again, this is a non-exhaustive list, but these are the most common generic resource agencies that crop up. And just to go further, just to clarify even further on the use of these generic resources. Now, if you're thinking like, okay, well, regional centers are payers of last resort. So that means that's it. They're just like, okay, if they say, go to that generic resource or exhaust generic resource, come back to us once you've done that. It's like, does that let them off the hook completely? No. The regional center still has responsibilities and obligations. So regional centers are described as the generic targeted case management provider. What that means is that they should be making active efforts to actually coordinate and collaborate with other agencies. I mentioned before in my the example I had about the coordination between DOR and that person's regional center. And on top of that, regional centers also are supposed to help to ensure that there are no gaps in services. What that means is that if, let's say, in trying to obtain and pursue a service that you or your child needs, there's going to be a time where it's going to be hard, getting it into place, trying to determine the number of hours or which ones you qualify for. If that's going to result where there's going to be a gap in a service you need, the regional center has to act on that. And in fact, one tool that that families can use, if let's say it's a service where, yes, there could be a generic resource, but when and if and how they're going to get it is still unclear. Like, let's say IHSS. Like, okay, I'll apply for IHSS for my child. That's not, given due to that requirement about generic resources. But look, I'm overwhelmed. I and my children, we need in-home services ASAP. It's absolutely urgent. And we don't know how long this process is going to take with IHSS. We have to apply, they have to do an assessment, they have to do an evaluation, they've got to, break down, okay, what do we qualify for IHSS? How many hours of IHSS? Goodness knows how long that will take. And in the meantime, I and my child, we're not getting anything when we really need it right now. So you, regional center, I need you to provide those in-home services. Give me those services in the interim while we figure out this process of, can I in fact actually get this from the generic resource? That is called gap funding. So that is a strategy that you can use to push the regional center and to actually covering a service you need while you're actively pursuing it, or at least seeing if you can pursue it from a generic resource. So I put that down. They can pay for services while coverage is being pursued pending a final decision or until commencement of that service from that generic resource. But that being said, you do need, if you're making that argument, you do need to show that it's a needed service and that the delay in services will harm you or your child. And if, let's say, even after all that, the regional center is like, no, we're going to stand for, we're not going to pay for that. You still got to, even if you need it, even if you argue that you need it, you still got to go through generic resources. We're not going to do anything. You know what? You have a right to appeal that decision. The regional center has to give you that decision, that confirm in writing, like, okay, you said you needed this right away. We're not going to pay for it. Here it is in writing. And once you get that notice, you have a right to actually appeal it. to actually go and fight that decision, challenge it, either at mediation or before an administrative law judge. And it's supposed to be like a more informal, quick process to resolve these disagreements. I've done a whole presentation just on appeals, but I am letting you know that even if after all that, you still have a right to challenge a regional center if they still dig in their feet as to a service request that is based on a very urgent and critical need. And finally, if another aspect that you can remind the regional center is that they actually have an obligation to identify and help you pursue generic resources, all possible sources of funding. So it's kind of, I've actually had that before where a client was like, I think it was a client who was a foster mother going through the process of adopting these children who recently were found eligible for services. And she was like, I really need help here. I need I'm overwhelmed, and on top of dealing with this whole foster care and the adoption process, it's just I need a lot more help at home for me and my foster child. And the regional center is like, oh no, the generic resources. I'm sure the foster care agency or the Department of Human Health Services will deal with that. And that was that was something where we were like, no, you regional center, you got to do more than that. You got to actually, seriously consider what this family needs and look into what options are actually available to them and help them to access those options, those generic resources. So that is, I am including that as a way where you can really remind the regional center of their obligation to actively help you, even if it's actually to look into and identify those generic resources. Another important aspect I want to bring up, because it has come up quite a bit amongst those who have contacted us, is natural supports. So natural supports, as defined in the law, and are basically those who are in your life, or if you if it's your child who's a client of the regional center, you are your child's natural support. So it's going to be people who are part of that person's life, family, friends, even neighbors, who are able to help you and meet those needs for free. This is where it comes in, where oftentimes we see regional centers will be like, oh, well, you got to go through your natural supports, go through, have mom and dad, pay for this, have the idea being, the expectation being that, well, in any family, even family, including those where there are no, there's involving those who don't have any disabilities, there's the expectation, generally the family supports each other. You use those resources amongst the natural supports. So families that use the same resources they would use typically for children who don't have disabilities. And so that is often like, so that could be an argument, and we've seen that before, where it's like, oh yeah, go through, basically like find, get your family to provide that before we cover that. And we just want to push back on, okay, that in of itself is not a reason to for the regional center to just deny a service for you because of a natural support. And I've seen it where they would have, where regional centers have argued natural supports, even in a situation where you actually wouldn't expect it, even for a person without a disability. So for example, a 25-year-old woman who is, who needs, one of her services she gets from the regional center is actually transportation, because she takes these courses to help her become a therapist. And so, she qualifies for services, but she's got these specific goals. She wants to get those classes, get that training, aim toward having a career as a therapist, but she needs transportation because she can't drive. And so the regional center was paying for it, but then it's like, oh, actually, you know what? We're thinking maybe you don't actually need this transportation. Why don't you have your parents drive you? It's like, this is a 25-year-old woman. Her parents are elder. Her parents are older. They've got health issues. They've got their own commitments and careers. Of course, she's like, of course my parents can't drive me. That's not a viable natural support. And so I've just given you an example where I was like, that excuse from the regional center, do not let that fly. as a reason to permit them to cut or reduce or terminate a service. And also in developing an IPP for, let's say, a child. That being said, the service coordinator, they will explore those natural supports that are able and willing to provide IPP services. But if it's a situation where it's like, look, we're at our limit, we're about to break here, we're overwhelmed, then it's like the regional center has to actually respond to that need. Now, if they say no, if they still say no, they still got to give you your right to appeal, to actually challenge that decision. But they can't be like, natural supports, so we're out, we're not gonna get involved. No, they got to respond to your request, if it's either by authorizing it, or if not that, at least letting you know that you have a right to challenge their decision to basically not do anything. We added this slide because it has been something that's come up before as a potential excuse when families were trying to find, especially if there was a service where they needed it and it was actually written, or it was acknowledged as a need, but they couldn't they couldn't find providers for that service. So there are no vendors, we can't do anything. And again, that's not an excuse to not provide that service. If a service is written into you or your child's IPP, the regional center has to provide that service. Now, what that means is that, okay, well, what can the regional center do if there's no actual providers? Well, then in that case, they got to think outside the box, really look into all options, look for, actively look for vendors, put out requests for proposals about to check on which ones can actually meet this need. Even look into vendors from other regional center catchment areas. That's an option as well. If there's no one in their own catchment area that can meet that need, what about this other neighboring regional center's catchment area? Do they have a vendor that's also close enough to meet this need? They can approach a vendor that's not necessarily in that service code, but can provide a similar service. So it's like, okay, you can't find a respite provider. What about personal assistance? What about ILS or SLS agencies? Maybe they could provide something like that. Come on, look into all options here. Another important factor, and this has actually come up when it's like a matter of rates, because that is very much an issue of like, yeah, it's not just about finding a provider. It's finding a provider that's also willing, that especially if it's like a particular need where they would demand a higher rate to even agree to be that provider of a service. That's where they can actually put in a request to DDS to fund or develop a new program, service, or support, or to which includes also to pay a higher rate. This is also something that has come up. I've had clients experience before where it was like, look, you say you don't have providers, but the thing is, my child has these very specific unique needs that calls for a provider that is going to need training and expertise that would require them to be paid at a much higher rate than what would be a typical rate that the regional center is paying for. So the regional center is like, well, what do we do? It's like, oh, then there is a path. Go to DDS. If we identify a provider that can meet the need, but needs to be paid a higher rate based on their training and expertise, there's got to be a basis for the higher rate. They can't just demand one. Then they actually can go through the process of going through and see if they can get an exception to typical rate with DDS. And there's actually a name to that process. It's called the Health and Safety Waiver Application Process. Now, that being said, that process in and of itself can be challenging and time consuming, but it can be a means by which, and one I've actually helped families with, and trying to find a provider both finding a provider, but also making sure that they get the funding necessary to convince them to be that provider for a particular child or a family member that has significant or unique needs. So now that I've talked over just kind of like the broad overview of the foundations of the regional center system, I'm going to go right back to what I mentioned before, the importance of the IPP, the individual program plan, and how this process is really central to your effort into getting the services that you or your child needs. So the IPP process is treat it as a contract, because it is a legal type process between the consumer, or in this case, if it's a minor child, the parent or the conservator. But the idea being that it is a legal process that involves services to a consumer and also the regional center providing it. That IPP is through the IPP process, there's this document, the IPP document. It's usually a packet, and that packet lists the services and supports that you or your child needs. This IPP is and amongst this processes are these meetings. Meetings are IPP meetings are how are part of how the IPP is carried out. And these meetings have to be held once every 3 years. But usually, as far as I've seen with the regional centers, they hold it once a year. So the annual IPP. Now, that being said, if you're thinking like, wait, I have this serious issue going on where like there's a service need that's not being met, or something changed and I really need to talk about something to do with a service, do I have to wait until the next annual IPP? No, you don't. You can request an IPP at any time if you need one. And in fact, if you make that request, the regional center has to hold that IPP meeting within 30 days. It could be later if all the parties agree, but that is the timeline. And in fact, on top of that, if let's say it's an urgent issue, like, okay, we can't even wait 30 days. We need everyone at a table now. You can hold an emergency IPP meeting that must be held within 7 days. But you're going to have to be clear about why this is an emergency, why this requires an emergency IPP meeting. And of course, it is a person-centered plan. Why is this IPP important? Well, like I said, it lists the services and supports the regional center will provide. And why that is important is if it's written into the IPP, and not just written, but actually like this, like example, this family needs a break from the constant caregiving. So regional center will pay 30 hours per month of respite. Once that's written in there, regional center has to provide it. If a service is not written into the IPP, you can't count on the regional center providing it. And this is important because we've actually had clients or calls from people who are like, oh, the service coordinator, you said them over the phone. Yeah, you'll get that service. We'll authorize it. And I was like, was it? But they haven't done anything since then. And I was like, did they follow up with something in writing? Was it written into the IPP? Do you have a draft of the addendum? And they're like, oh, not yet. It's like, shoot. Or like, okay, at least get something in an email or a letter acknowledging this. So that's why it's important to make sure that it's not just about identifying a need, it's actually getting it written into the IPP. So what to identify at an IPP? You're like, okay, my plan is IPP meeting, what to prepare for, how do I go about this? So a really important aspect to the IPP that is going to factor into your ability to get the services you need are going to be the goals or objectives. And so it's not just identifying what service the regional center will pay for. The regional center will provide the service as long as it meets a IPP goal or objective. So that's what I mean in the top point about hopes, plans, goals that are specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time limited. So, a goal would be, just to think off the top of my head, because we had one big issue we actually had where clients who were not only had developmental disabilities, but were also deaf, where I was like, okay, these are individuals who, on top of their the needs, on top of their developmental disability, they had a need for ways to communicate effectively, like signing or pictures or some other ways where they'd have to communicate effectively. And so it's like, okay, we need to have this as an IPP goal. That was actually something where we had a client where it's like, okay, you the regional center, you have to add a goal on communication because this person has this unique need and this is an important area of their life that needs to be brought up. And also, what are you going to do to meet that IPP need, that IPP goal? You know, are you going to provide interpreters? Are you going to provide other kinds of signing support? Are you going to provide just like other devices or AT to help them communicate effectively? So that's the importance of really identifying the goal and how, you know, the goal based on an area of need and using that to get specific services from the regional center. So that's what so that's what I mean when I talk about the goals, the objectives, your needs, how those needs will be met in the form of services. And then there'll be a breakdown. And then from there, that's when you talk about, discuss, negotiate the amount of services, the frequency, the range of dates, who will be responsible for the service and when each item will be accomplished or at least reviewed. And also who will pay for what. Now, sometimes, that being said, sometimes regional centers will actually put down a goal, but they'll be like, oh, but a generic resource will cover that. Like speech, you know, let's say it's you have a minor child, school aged, and they're like, oh, they have a need for, you know, improving their expressive speech therapy, but the school district is going to pay for that. So we're going to add this as an IPP goal, but the school's going to pay for it. Now, is that still helpful? Yes, it is. Actually, still acknowledging the need is still useful because because there are circumstances where if, let's say, a generic resource is no longer available, like let's say a pandemic that closes all the schools, all of a sudden it's like, oh, regional center, this IPP goal looks like it's not being met. And so we're going to actually go back to you and request that service from you. So that's why even just having a goal, even if it's provided by a generic agency and not the regional center, it does help to have that written into the IPP. Things to remember before you go into that IPP meeting. Notify the regional center in writing that, and again, this is up to you if you want to have it recorded, that you want to have the IPP meeting recorded, but you should give 24 hours notice. Also, if the regional center if they're the ones asking to record it and you're like, you know what, I'm not comfortable having it be recorded by you guys, you can object. You can actually object and the regional center has to respect that. And that's actually gotten a little easier now with like IPP meetings being held, you know, remotely and virtually, being like Zoom or Teams, where I'm just like, hey, we're gonna record this, and so you know, we pop in, put record. I know that you can do that with Teams. Bring a note taker, and so even if, you know, recording or not, it helps to really take notes, keep track of, you know, what was discussed at the IPP meeting. One thing I do when I've gone to IPP meetings for clients is I will actually, in addition to like, you know, jotting down notes, I'll actually follow up with an email of like, my understanding is that we discussed these things at this IPP meeting, but, you know, let me know if you don't agree with the outline that I took away from that meeting. Another important thing is you can actually ask for a decision maker at the IPP. It is your right to have one. And decision maker is the person who makes decisions, someone who actually makes a final decision about a service need. Now, that being said, it can be challenging because a lot of the times it's going to be, you know, the lower level service coordinators. They're the ones who will hold an IPP. I've heard it where I was like, you ask for a service or you have a service need. It's like, I'm going to have to go back to my supervisor for that. It's like, okay, fine. Let's hold another IPP meeting and have your supervisor there. And that way we'll know for sure if this service is approved or not. So that's what's meant in that point about like, if there isn't a final decision at an IPP meeting, you actually have a right to hold another one within 15 days. Or it can be later if the parties agree, but you still have that right to hold another IPP to really address like, okay, what's the decision here? And also for those who, if I could politely request others who are unmuted, if you could mute, that'd be great. It's just because it's this whole thing is itself being recorded. So, you know, you probably best you don't, it'd be good not be making sure that stuff isn't like ends up popping up if other people listen to this later. What to identify at an okay, yeah, I mentioned that. And this, again, I'm just going to really skim over this because I've done like presentations just on specific services. Like I've done ones on just respite. I've done ones on just independent living. So this is just going to be a quick overview of like, and of like, just to take into account as you're figuring out what service do I need and how can I get it from the regional center. So we added this as to like, these are important considerations that regional centers themselves have to consider. And also, it's also something that is encouraged in the law itself. Safety. What services do you need to keep you safe? And that applies whether it's your child or if it's you yourself and you're an adult, or if your child's an adult. Community access is a big one. I mentioned in a previous slide, the importance of being in a less restrictive, a very, more open, free, and integrated setting. So basically, how can you get out into the community and participate in that community? This is especially relevant if if you or your child are starting to get older and or even like reaching adulthood. That's where it's like, okay, you are as an adult, you have a right to seriously consider what ways can I be a part of the community and not be in some segregated, restricted, tight situation. And the last one is actually really relevant for minor children remaining at home. So the regional center, or the Lanterman Act, the law, actually puts a huge emphasis on keeping families together, especially if there's a young child, of like, look, children, these young children who have disabilities, it is in their best interest that they stay with the family, stay in the home, and try to avoid a situation where they are being placed in some out-of-home restrictive setting because they're away from their family, and it's disruptive and to their it's already disruptive to them and their development. So for minor children, there is a big priority placed on living with the family. And in fact, the law specifically says, regional centers, you got to use innovative and creative means to keep the family together, especially if there's a situation where things are so bad that child is about to be like placed in some outside setting, like a group home or such. It's like, okay, regional centers, you need to really work. You need to listen to the family and do whatever you can to make sure that they stay together. So that I add that because it is a very important tool you can use if there's a situation like that of I need more in-home services to keep everyone and my child together in the family home. So things to remember about services: to get a service, establish a need. I need this service, or my child needs this service, that the need is related to you or your child's developmental disability. It's like, yeah, this is a service I need to address some symptom of autism or cerebral palsy. But again, you can be creative, figure out ways to really make that link. And argue that. And also, as I mentioned in previous slides, really keep mindful of addressing like, look, I've looked into generic resources and they're not available, or it's going to take time to get them, so gap fund that, or it's not exactly the appropriate service I need. And of course, natural supports of like, look, you say that the parents or family members can pay for this, can do this. We can't. We're overwhelmed. We need your help. And if you're still going to say no, well, then give us a notice. And our rights to appeal. So this is just the tips to keep in mind as you're figuring out what services you and your child needs. And I'm just going to, again, skim over this. I know we're already at 150. So these are just a list of services that the regional centers can provide. And I just want to emphasize, it's a non-exhaustive list. So the Lanterman Act, the law, there actually is a list of specific services. And I even put the code. But again, it's not exhaustive. It's like, okay, look, if there's a service that based on your unique needs or your child's unique needs is something that would benefit you, addresses your disability, helps you stay at home, or helps you be more integrated in the community, and it's not listed in that list of examples in the law, that's fine. The regional center should still seriously consider that. It's a non-exhaustive list. It can be virtually any service if there's an established need and there's no, generic resource that could cover it. So I also just include examples of like how regional centers will have lists of vendors. And there's also lists from DDS itself. There's also DDS initiatives. These are just information to be helpful as you look into like, okay, who can provide that service? Also, that being said, there's actually been a big there's always been this big emphasis on participant directed services. Basically like, you know what, I don't really, there's not really any vendor here that is that I trust, that is appropriate. Can I choose my own vendor? Can I choose someone else to be the respite provider, like a family member? Yeah, you can. So there is that freedom of choice. There is that participant directed factor. So it doesn't have to necessarily be from a strict list. I just wanted to bring that up in addition to what's listed on the slide. And then, as I mentioned before, a really helpful resource is our RULA manual. And in fact, we include the chapter about services. This is actually the chapter about services that families can get to keep everyone at home. So, you know, a big one is it'll address things like respite, among other types of services. And I just put down the examples of like services that would be beneficial for you or your child. But again, still would be one where you would have to explain the need for and then develop IPP goals that support the need for these services. So ranging from, you know, a respite's a big one. I believe every regional center has a policy on respite, from respite to even to diapers. You know, that you can, I've had families of very young children who were clients of the regional center. They were actually able to get diapers from the regional center. If their children were 3 or over 3, then they were, you know, that they made it as long as they made it clear the need for diapers, they got them paid for. Even if they were under 3, as long as they argued financial need, that was also a way they could get it. So just an example of a specific service here that had come up and really helped a certain family. And the following slides are really just more lists of services. So I'll just like blow through those. So yeah, more service lists, you know, more information. I include the code that actually lists these services, but again, non-exhaustive. It doesn't have to be specific. You don't have to actually specifically look into what's listed here. If you could think outside the box, it's based on the individual needs. It's person-centered. And yeah, just more services, more of the examples going on. Oh, this is an important one because this was actually one of the recent changes to the Lanterman Act. So a service that had recently been prohibited from being paid for by regional centers came back. It was restored. It was these are camping and social recreation services. So now the service that before regional centers were like, no, we can't pay for that. The law says we you know, except for certain situations, we can't pay for that. Now they can. So each regional center, I believe most of the regional centers are already in the process or have already revised their policies to include social recreation and camp. Another big one is coordinated family support. That's a more recent one, and I included the link just so you know what, you know, get some more feedback as to that. Now that being said, we at DRC, we are already encountering problems with the social recreation in that, you know, regional centers putting up policies of like, oh yeah, you can only get this amount, or you can only get social rec at like $200 per month, where we're like, whoa. Where does it say that in the law that restored these services? There's nothing in there about like a specific cap and stuff like that. So, you know, while it's good news and the service has been restored, it is something where we have been getting some serious concerns and feedback about like, okay, are there some still being issues about obstacles including through their own policies to these services. But I'm just giving you a heads up that this is an important service, and the other new service that has been that is now being made available to families. Okay, so these are our resources. These are our website. There's the Rights Under the Lanterman Act. Another great one is the Office of Clients' Rights, OCRA. That's our sister agency. So I've definitely coordinated a lot with OCRA. We do a lot of overlapping work. And I apologize. I know that we're at 1:56, but I'll do my best to answer what questions we have in the time remaining.
Well, thank you so much, Emily. I know we do have some questions. I think Diane is going to be our narrator for the questions. Is that still all right, Diane?
Yeah, that's fine. Excuse me.
I wrote down a few things while you were talking, though, that the health and safety waiver application process and emergency IPP. I thought those were really helpful things for our staff, the staff at the FRCs to know. So and the Rula manual. Those are some of my takeaways really quick. All right, Diane.
Okay, so under the Lanterman law, what is the timeline for getting approval for the requested services? And Grace says, thank you for your answer.
So there's no, as far as I know, there's no like strict specific timeline. But that being said, I've seen, one of the complaints we've gotten are like, oh, the service coordinator is like, oh, we'll look into it. I'll talk to my supervisor, and it's like weeks and weeks and weeks, and you're like, when are you gonna actually respond and do something about this? So there are strategies where you can push the regional center to respond regarding a service need. So I mentioned before, like hold an IPP meeting, and it's like, okay, have we reached a final decision here? No? Okay, let's hold another IPP meeting within 15 days. And I've actually used that of like, if they didn't hold an IPP meeting, they're like, we talked about this, but there was no final decision. I've actually I've instructed clients to be like, okay, we didn't just reach a final decision, and you didn't hold another IPP meeting, even though there was still these pending issues, then we're going to treat that effectively as a denial. You're basically saying no by not responding and not holding another IPP. So give me a notice of action letter. Like, I asked for this service, or you're going to cut this service. You need to give me a notice, and you need to include my appeals rights, basically like my right to file for fair hearing. So that's one tactic to push the regional center to actually be responsive to the request. I actually had a client where she did that, or I told her to do that. And the regional center, which, for a while had just been kind of like waffling and not really giving clear answers, or suddenly being super responsive because they really didn't want to give a notice with the appeals rights. So just that's one tactic you can use to really get the regional center to be more responsive. And if a service is already written into the IPP, they need to provide it ASAP. And in that case, it's like there is no timeline. They got to provide it now. Now there could be factors of like, okay, we have trouble finding a vendor, but that's why I added the slide of like, okay, they need to really think outside the box and actually make active efforts. They can't just like, shrug their shoulders and be like, well, that's that we've done all we could do.
Okay, great. Another question: what advice would you give a parent if an assigned vendor provider has a wait list?
If an assigned provider has a wait list, if the family insists on that provider, then unfortunately they are going to have to abide by however long it would take to get through that list. That being said, it also could be if it's like a service need that needs to start right away, or that time is of the essence. It is important to bring that up before the service coordinator of like, are there any other providers that can do this right now? Can we if not here, what about other catchment areas? And this is especially important if it's not Lanterman Act services, but early intervention. That one is very much, so it's technically separate, early intervention and Lanterman Act services for age 3 and older, but they're all directed by regional centers. So that's where the common factor comes in. And those are services where it's like, no, we need to get these right now. They're critical to development. So that is where it's like, you really need to push the regional center to act more quickly as to that. And it can also be, it can also be something where could possibly be grounds for requesting a notice of action of like, this is a service that I or my child needs. You're not making enough of an effort to actually find other options except for this agency where there's a super long wait list. We need to seriously consider other options that are going to act quickly on it. So just so it's a challenging situation, but I'm giving you like just potential ways you can work around that or push the regional center to actually look into other ways to actually meet that need.
Okay, great.
Diane, we've reached our end time. Emily, are you stay on for a couple of minutes? If folks...
Yeah, I can stay longer. Yeah,
I appreciate that. All right, Diane.
Okay, thanks. If the generic service is not adequate to meet the need, can regional center then pay for the service? And the example she is giving is mental health services.
Generally, as to that question, yes, but be prepared to argue why. Like, this is a so it's like, okay, this is a service I've been getting that is available through a generic resource, but it's either not appropriate, it's not actually meeting that need, it's not actually quite the same or the service that adequately addresses that need. And so just making it clear that this is why this generic resource, it has in fact been explored, and this is why the regional center is the one that should be that should address that need. Now, mental health is and that can include mental health services, but it is one where it's like, try if you can make that link to the developmental disability. And I think I'm just trying to remember examples. I did have a client where she was, in addition to her developmental disability, I believe it was combination of autistic spectrum and also intellectual disability. She also had these various other psychiatric comorbid diagnoses like PTSD and personality disorder, those kinds of disabilities. And it was like, look, in order for me to access services from the regional center, these providers, those regional center providers, they have to be trained to learn how to manage my triggers, my symptoms. And I want you, the regional center, to pay for that training, including even getting my psychiatrist or psychologist to provide that training. And the regional center was like, oh no, or basically arguing like they were not responsible for that. That's when we came in and we actually did help that person make a strong case for like, look, the mental health here is inextricably linked to the developmental disability. I can't benefit from the services because these providers don't know how, because these providers are like triggering me or doing other ways where I just completely break down and close off. So they need to be trained to also understand my psychiatric symptoms, my mental health needs. So that is an example where she was, where that individual really made a good case and actually was able to persuade an ALJ to get the regional center to pay for her psychiatrist / psychologist to train her ILS and SLS providers.
Okay, great. Here's somebody who is asking you to discuss provisional eligibility. They're having problems at their regional center.
Oh yes, provisional eligibility. So I'm trying to recall this from the top of my head. Yeah, that was a recent change. And the benefit of provisional eligibility is that it expands eligibility for children who have aged out of early education, who are very young, but in the sense of like, as long as they meet some criteria, even if they don't meet all of the criteria for regional center eligibility. So, for example, like the law, to be eligible for regional center services, you have to have at least exhibit at least functional limitations of 3 out of 7 areas of major life activity. The law actually just lists all 7 of those areas. So example, among them are like receptive and expressive language, mobility, learning, but you have to show at least 3 functional limitations. Well, for the exception being, if you have like a very young child from ages 3 to 5 that have just aged out of early start, let's say it's like, okay, if they can show that they have exhibit functional limitations in 2, not 3, but 2, that is enough for provisional eligibility. The understanding being like, okay, these children are very young. They're still, figuring out what their limitations are. So even though they haven't met all their criteria, 3, as long as they show at least 2, that's enough to be provisionally eligible. But once they turn 5 years old, okay, we're going to do a reassessment, and then we're going to know for sure if they actually do exhibit limitations in at least 3 of those 7 major life activities. So that is provisional eligibility and how that can be used to actually get services for a child who has just aged out of early start, but still exhibits some limitations in at least 2 of those areas.
Okay, great. The next question is asking you to repeat the name of something. So I'm sure she typed it right after you said it, but it was health and safety. It was related to health and safety.
Yeah. It's called the health. I'm trying to remember if it was health and or health or /or safety waiver application. So it's basically the process of of like the regional centers requesting the DDS to approve an exception to the typical rate of like, okay, DDS, will you approve for the, we're going to apply and see if you will approve of a higher rate. Now, that being said, health and safety waiver process has its own frustrations in that you have to find a provider who is willing to go through that of like actually, you know, the paperwork and the process and cooperating with trying to find cooperating with the process of submitting that application to DDS, and it can take time. And there's also no guarantee. If the DDS could be like, yeah, we've seen your application, and we're still going to say no. But it is a tool, and one I've actually pushed before, especially if there was a real strong case where I was like, look, this person has very significant, unique needs. There are no current providers willing to provide that service except the ones who are like, yeah, we'll provide this service, but it's got to be 2 to 1. And given the safety issues, we got to get paid this rate. And it's like, here's an agency that's willing to do it, but not only at this rate, given the expertise and the experience. Here's, you know, they've made a good case for why they need to be paid a higher rate. And that was actually a way we could, and we also expedited it because this particular client was about to be released from prison into like, basically into the streets. So we were like, look, you need to move through this quickly. And this is why this person needs these services, because he's going to end up on the street and a danger to him and that could be a health and safety issue. Again, that's where the health and safety comes in, the health and safety for himself or for other people. And so we were able to get that DDS approval to pay for a higher rate. So I'm just giving you an example, but also the potential challenges in pursuing that option.
Right. Are there timelines for service coordinators to call or email a family back regarding a family who has left a message or sent an email?
The service coordination should be consistent. That being said, there's no specific timeline. And I mean, I try to be understanding, because service coordinators, they have had massive caseloads, often way bigger than what was intended. But that being said, they should still be responsive. And so that's why it's like, if they're still not like, if it's a service need or it's an issue that like, okay, I can't keep waiting another week or several more weeks, that's where a tactic you should use is IPP meeting, because an IPP meeting actually has a timeline as defined under the law, 30 days, or if it's an emergency IPP meeting, 7 days. So that's a way where it's like, okay, I'm going to have to, you're still not going to be responsive. This is an important issue. We're going to have to get everyone to the table here. So I'm going to request an IPP meeting, and you're going to have to hold one. And I've actually seen it where I was like, oh, so-and-so's out on vacation. It's like, well, then, okay, fine. Find a placeholder service coordinator, you know, someone who can, it doesn't have to be this service coordinator. It could be someone to take their place, at least for the purposes of holding this IPP meeting. And also get your case manager there so they can make a decision at this meeting, so we don't have to keep dragging this out. So just, and again, tactics for getting everyone to the table and actually being responsive to an issue or a need.
Great. The next to last question is for families who have IFSPs. A common issue at their regional center has been that the child requires OT, speech, or another therapy that's been designated, and the family waits months and months for a vendor and then ages out of early start. The family is then told they can't receive any service because their child has turned 3. And what can they do to recoup those services that were never provided?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so so this is one in the realm of early start, early intervention, and I just want to emphasize the law is very clear in the not the Lanterman Act, but there is a mention of early start in the Lanterman Act, as well as in other portions of the California Code of Regulations. And it's very clear about the importance of expedience about getting those services ASAP, because these are services provided at critical stages of development. The whole point is to get them early in life to address those delays before that person, so they can benefit to the maximum extent before they age out. And so that is something where it's like you need if it's like, oh, you have to wait a long time. Okay, IFSP meeting, I believe that like similar, while again, it's technically different, it's not Lanterman Act. I believe that your right to request an IFSP meeting is similar. And also, if necessary, you can file a complaint. You can actually go through due process. There is an appeals process for early start. And the benefit is they're actually supposed to move faster, compared to like the appeals process for regional center services. I can't remember off the top of my head, but DDS has a whole page about your right to file a complaint, to file for due process, and that it's supposed to be a lot quicker for the sole purpose of we need to resolve this right away. But there are actual laws that say that you can, and if I could I actually have an early start PowerPoint where it was like I included some of the language from statutes where it's like regional centers or DDS as the lead agency has to respond ASAP, to the point where even if there are generic resources, the regional center still has to provide that service under early start without forcing the family to have to exhaust those generic resources, because it's that important for them to access it ASAP. And I just want to give you an example. I actually had a case where a family of a child had they had actually applied for eligibility, and they had called and be like, we want to do an assessment to see if our child is eligible for early start, and the regional centers kind of like didn't respond for a while, and then they were like, okay, and then they followed up via email, and the regional center finally responded months later, and they're like, okay, we'll do the early start assessment and that kind of thing. And the thing was is that during that time the family had to pay out of pocket for services like ABA, because it was something that their very young child, under age 3, needed. And when she was finally found eligible for early start, the regional center then came in to cover that service. But by that point, the parents were already out a lot of their own funds, just getting the service in place that they should have gotten earlier, because they had actually reached out to the regional center months before to request an assessment, and the regional center didn't do anything until the parents did it again, reached out again. So they filed for due process on that, where they're like, look, regional center, they're supposed to pay for this because they didn't follow through and actually start this eligibility process for early start, and as a result, we had to pay out of pocket until they finally did. And those were services our daughter needed, and services we ended up fleshing out a lot of money for. And the judge sided with them and said, regional center, yeah, they're right, regional center, you didn't go follow through fast enough. It's the whole point of early start is expediency, quick. When the moment the family called you, that was when you should have started, but you didn't. You waited months until the family had to contact you again. And during that time, their child was out crucial services, and she would have been found eligible for. So you, regional center, you're going to have to pay the family back for the ABA that they paid for. The story doesn't actually end there. The regional center, their attorney actually tried to push the tried to threat. I guess threaten's a strong word, but they actually tried to intimidate the family into backing off, even getting paid back the ABA that they funded, by saying like, we think the ALJ is wrong, we're going to appeal. And we got involved, and we were like, good luck appealing that, because the law very, very clearly says that you were the importance of acting as quick as possible, not just in providing the services, but also for, assessing. And and if you dare do that, good luck, because we're going to get involved. And the regional center backed off. They're like, okay, we'll pay you back. So just giving you an example of a situation of just how strong that language is about the importance of getting early start ASAP.
Right. And the final question is going back to the provisional eligibility. And this person is asking what services regional center can pay for if your child has provisional eligibility.
Under provisional eligibility, any service that a person would get under, I don't want to say normal, typical eligibility. So the great thing about provisional eligibility is that while you don't have to meet all the criteria, 2 instead of the 3 functional limitations out of the 7 life activities, provisional eligibility is the same thing as being fully eligible. You have a right to services like respite and everything else, as long as you, have it written to your IPP, establish that need. Now, that being said, be aware, though, that provisional eligibility will be relooked at the age of 5. Again, I'm going off of memory here, or so, where the regional center will do a review. Where like, okay, we're gonna go back to this and see if you actually now we'll see if you or your child actually has limitations in the 3, not just the 2. So remember, so you have access to all the rights as any other Lanterman Act client, even under provisional eligibility, but it is something that's going to be relooked at by the age of 5.
Okay, great. And that is all the questions. So thank you. And I did want to point out to everyone, I put the survey link in the chat. So if you're still around, we'd really appreciate you filling that survey out.
All right. Thanks, Diane, for all the support. And Emily, thank you for a fabulous presentation, and to Raymond and Leilani for all their support during this too. We appreciate your time. And I have a feeling that there might be some follow-up questions. So we'll pass those on if that's all right. And to all you who stayed on, appreciate it. And we will see you at the next webinar.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, DRC.
All right. Do you guys need anything from us, Emily, or
I don't believe so. And I
well,
think
fill out
Lonnie
a
already-
satisfaction form for you to tell how great you were?
Oh yeah, yeah. The surveys are great, and at least that's what I remember Lonnie and Raymond really, because it does help to get that feedback about how we can improve, what additional types of trainings we can provide. So, but thank you for having me, and I'm going to pop off because I have another meeting I have to go to.
Absolutely. I
but
know
yeah.
we lost a couple people too for other conflicting meetings they had to run. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much.
Alrighty, take care.